minutes after, so we're going to get started. My name is Roger Daly, and glad to welcome all of you here tonight to hear this presentation by Tim Barton of Wallbuilders. It's going to be a little bit different flavor than tomorrow night's presentation, and specifically on the impact of pastors and their impact in the society, in our culture, in our country as it was forming. And we have a rare opportunity, a privilege to have Tim Barton, David Barton's son, with us tonight. And without anything else, I'll let him share any other information. Tim, it's up to you.
Pastor, thanks for having us out, and thank you guys for coming out tonight. There's a lot of stuff I want to talk about and I want to get into, but I want to start looking at our nation. Because when you look at our nation, one of the unique things about our nation, we are unlike any other nation in the world. In fact, every single year we set a new world record for the nation living the longest under the same piece of paper, the same constitution. We've only had one form of government in our entire existence. So many really unique, exceptional things. In fact, just for example, this last year, if you looked at the United Nations, this last year there were 192 member nations present of the United Nations. We were one of the only nations present that doesn't average a revolution every 30 to 40 years. That's really impressive, because you can look around the rest of the world right now, and you look at Egypt or Libya and Sudan, so many places that are going through revolutions right now, and to the rest of the world this is normal. For us as Americans, we look and think, we can't imagine every 30 years, every 40 years, but we are so blessed with stability in America. Not only do we have stability, I mentioned we still are living in our original framework of government. We've only had one constitution, only one form of government. When we went through our American Revolution, there were lots of nations going through revolutions. In fact, if you look over at France, France was going through revolution at a very similar time that we were. Just a few years after us, they went through their revolution. Since their revolution, now since ours, we've only had one constitution. Since the French Revolution, they've had 15 constitutions. In fact, if you move over and you go to Poland, since 1921, Poland has had 7 constitutions. If you move north of Poland, you have Russia. Russia, since 1917, has had 4. If you go over to Afghanistan, Afghanistan's had 5 since the War on Terror. They now have 6. We can go around the rest of the world, and they go through constitutions like crazy. But as Americans, we're still enjoying our first. We have such stability as Americans. In fact, not only do we have stability, we have prosperity as Americans. In fact, we make up only 4% of the world's population, but we account for 31% of the world's wealth. Now, you would think 4% of the world maybe should have 4% of it. We're 4% and have a majority of the wealth. We are so blessed to live where we live, to have what we have. In fact, the U.S. Census Bureau came out this last year, and they said that if you were to live below the poverty line in America, which, by the way, it's interesting the way we define poverty line in America, but they said if you were to live below the poverty line in America, you're still more likely to have a telephone, to have a television, to have an air conditioner, to drive a car, to eat more red meat, and have more living space than if you were in the middle class in Europe. Now, this is below the poverty line. You're still more likely to have all of those things than if you were in the middle class of the second wealthiest country in the world. Our poor people, better than the middle class second. We are so blessed to be Americans. Now today we don't hear much about the success of the American dream, the American culture, the American nation. In fact, you turn on your news, you hear about all the problems and the issues, and we should change and be like somebody else. We've lost this idea known as American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is a term that was given to us by Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a French philosopher and writer. He came to America in the 1830s because even back then they could tell we were different. And he came to America because he wanted to see what made us different. He spent a year going from state to state to state. And after he had gone to the States, he actually wrote a book called Democracy in America. But what he said was the position of the Americans is quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar one. And that's where we get this idea of American exceptionalism, that we and what we have is so exceptional. Well, today we don't hear a lot about American exceptionalism. In fact, Congress is debating over and over and over about how we can change and be like other nations of the world because we have forgotten how blessed we are to have what we have. And I love the way, when you look at America, I love the way that President Andrew Jackson talked about what made us different. He said, you want to know what fundamentally makes us different than every other nation of the world? He said, the Bible is the rock on which our republic rests. Fundamentally, what sets us apart from the rest of the world is we have a different foundation. Our house was built on a different foundation, and it was the Word of God. In fact, you have other presidents, like President Roosevelt. He said we cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. He says when you read our history as a nation, you can't read it without understanding the impact of the Word of God. You have people like President Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan says, of the many influences that have shaped the United States of America into a distinctive nation and people, none may be said to be more fundamental and enduring than the Bible. When you look at what shaped our nation, we understood for hundreds of years the impact of the Word of God, the impact of the Bible. And so we understood when you look at our nation, when you understand what makes us exceptional, fundamentally it was the principles of the Word of God. It was Christianity that helped shape us and make us different than every other nation of the world. Now today, if we were to look at our history and I was to ask the question, well, who would we say are the leaders responsible for what we have in America? Who are the people that gave us what we have, that helped us get to the place we got to? Well, if we just look at history books today, maybe we asked our kids what they're learning in schools, we might find people like George Washington, which would be a good answer. Maybe people like Thomas Jefferson, good answer. People like John Hancock or John Adams, and those would be good answers. What's interesting, though, is when you look back at the Founding Fathers, if you were to ask them who was responsible, they come up with a different series and set of names than we do. In fact, in 1816, there were a group of students that went to John Adams, and they said, Mr. Adams, who would you say are the people most responsible for what we have in America today? John Adams said, well, that's very easy. You have people like the Reverend Samuel Cooper, the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew, the Reverend George Whitefield, the Reverend Charles Chauncey, and John Adams began to name pastors as the people most responsible for what we enjoy in America. Which is really interesting because, first of all, most of us don't know those guys up on there. Now, we might have heard of George Whitefield because of the First Great Awakening. We recognize that name. But we've never heard of Mayhew or Cooper or Chauncey, people that we're not familiar with. And by the way, not only are we not familiar with these white pastors, there's a group of black pastors we've never heard of that help shape who we are. People like the Reverend Richard Allen or the Reverend Alston Jones, the Reverend John Morant, the Reverend Lemuel Haynes, people that were so influential that we've never heard of today. But it's interesting because John Adams, when he was asked, how did we achieve what we achieved, he said, well, when you look at how we got to where we are, it was the influence of pastors. Now today, we for sure don't hear about the influence of pastors or the influence of Christianity in shaping our nation. But it's interesting because for hundreds of years, we used to understand that. In fact, if you look at a history textbook before the 1940s, you would find pastors. You would find Christian leaders. In fact, a great example, Clinton Rossiter, he was a professor at Cornell University. In fact, he was such an influential professor, they actually they gave him and they endowed the history chair after him. So the Cornell chair is actually the Clinton Rossiter Chair of History. But what he did is he actually went back and he wrote a book about our founding. And it's called The Seed Time of the Republic. And if you look at the Seed Time of the Republic, what he does in this book is he says there really were 6 people that really shaped our nation. 6 people that gave us what we have today. And the 6 people he listed were Benjamin Franklin, Richard Bland, the Reverend Thomas Hooker, the Reverend Roger Williams, the Reverend John Wise, and the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew. Now he says those 6 people are the ones that really gave us what we have. Only 2 of them are political. 4 of them were pastors. Which is interesting. And by the way, I mentioned in previous generations, we used to know that. Another good example is Alice Baldwin. And you can tell just by the picture, she's from a previous generation. Well, she was a history professor at Duke University. And one of the things that made her really significant, she has read more, or she did read more original sermons from the founding era than anybody else in history has. Pretty much any sermon that was written, she went back and read it. And what she did is she actually wrote a book. And her book was called The New England Clergy in the American Revolution. An amazing thing about this book is she actually was able to cite that when you look back at our Constitution, of the 27 grievances that were listed, all 27 had been preached from American pulpits prior to 1763. Over a dozen years before we ever had the American Revolution, pastors were talking about all the 27 grievances that we put in the Declaration.